Hello, everyone. I'm extremely honored as the Vice Provost for Global Local Affairs and Senior International Officer to make a few brief remarks about the session today, hosted by the CSJ Center for Reconciliation and Justice in collaboration with my area, Global Local Affairs, that will explore navigating identities, positionalities, and intersectionalities through programs that facilitate global engagements. With the implementation of the new Internationalization Strategic Plan, our goal of comprehensive internationalization includes many targeted areas for growth and coordination. And one of them certainly is to map out the numerous global learning experiences for students at LMU. To begin to put these options in front of students early in their undergraduate careers, we want to do that so that they are aware of and can intentionally build these experiences into their academic plans. As this wonderful event highlights, many offices and units offer students opportunities to go abroad in different capacities and with diverse outcomes. From alternative breaks in CSA to global immersions in BCLA to study abroad in GLA to Ignacio Companions in campus ministry. And that's just to name a few. All of these global learning experiences provide students with unique moments to think about their personal identities. And by identity, I mean as a very fluid concept in a new cultural context that's dynamic, that's shifting and changing throughout their experience, before they go abroad, during their experience, and then after. But importantly, presenting students with rewarding lifelong lessons about themselves and their interactions with individuals from different cultures to be able to reflect on that and continue to grow as a part of their formation as people with and for with others. In that spirit, I look forward to hearing from our amazing panelists about their identity development and growth and what those journeys while abroad really looked like. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Espinosa, and thank you all for being here with us today on our panel, Exploring Identity Through Internationalization. We are very excited to be in conversation really with one another around these questions of how do we go abroad, who goes abroad, what does this look like for each of us? Our panelists kind of came together really thinking about what it means as students of color to go and study in places that may be heritage locations for themselves and expanding beyond that to other kinds of locations. And what does that mean for their own development, their own identities? How do these things relate to one another? We do know in terms of the research that students of color are often underrepresented in the study abroad programs, and this has to do with financial reasons oftentimes. And those financial go beyond the cost of the trip itself, but the need to be able to do work study and to continue having funding for out-of-pocket expenses. So it's not just, okay, we can't pay for this experience and so we can't go. There's other factors, the sense of being away from home, the cultural relevance, and what they're going to meet in the locations that they go. And so this panel has really thought about, what are the kinds of locations that students of color can go to that represent potentially their own identities and how they make sense of those experiences. And then how we make this relevant and approachable for our students. And so the group of folks that we have here are folks who've done, I know some of us have done long-term and short-term, but we're really focusing today on the short-term experiences that allowed students to go have an experience, connect it with their education, connected with their personal development, and come back and kind of navigate some of those financial needs. And so today, I'll just quickly introduce our panel. We have Patrick Furlong from the Center for Service and Action, who will be talking about and giving an overview of our alternative breaks. We've got Jorge Cortez from the Center for the Study of Los Angeles, who will be giving an overview of some of the short-term experiences that he has led. And then we have this esteemed panel, and we're esteemed too. And I'm Dr. Deanna Cook. I'm in BCLA talking about global immersions, and we're esteemed, but we're really excited about our esteemed alumni who have actually taken these trips and will spend the majority of time sharing with us. So Isaac Cardenas, Carlos Rodriguez, and Megan Castillo have been instrumental in even helping us think about how these programs work. So I'm going to start off by actually turning this over to Patrick Furlong to tell us a little bit about CSA's programs.
Everyone, Deanna, thanks so much. It's great to be here with you all. It's great to see also these alums. It's great when you see people from different spaces and times and across kind of the internationalization, so to speak. I'm excited to be here with you today. Again, I work in the Pam Rector Center for Service and Action. And so we try and really kind of strive to be a student hub for service and justice activities. And one of the ways we do that is through what we call our Alternative Breaks program. And so to just kind of paint a quick overview of what we're talking about when we talk about Alternative Breaks, we're talking about a program that was started at LMU in 2003. And so it's coming up on 20 years where it's been an engagement, and it's opportunities to do local, national, and international immersions that take place over our breaks. So think winter break, spring break, summer break, those kind of varieties of opportunities. It's completely co-curricular. We try and work with faculty where we can. So we've worked with Dr. Cook in the past, we worked with different people, but it's a chance for students to really come together. And in recent years, I think what's really evolved in this program is a lot of these programs, you can kind of talk about where they started, where they're at, and where they're going. And I think a lot of these programs started in a really problematic place. So if you think poverty tourism, if you're familiar with that concept, it was really this notion of, oh, we're going to run these trips, they're going to go down, they're going to do community service. So picture college students going and doing a house building project in Nicaragua, and totally absent-minded to the fact that, to be blunt, college students really suck at building houses. They don't have an expertise, a background in that area. And a community there does not need inexperienced home builders coming in. They've got different systemic issues they're facing. They've got different things they're working on in their local community, and how we elevate that. And so the program's evolved, and I think it went from originally being those service type trips to being a justice focused trip. And the idea became, how are we getting folks to go and learn about different injustice issues? How are we saying we are going to center on racism in Appalachia? And we're going to talk about what exactly that looks like. We're going to spend time learning about it. And then when you're on the ground, we kind of defer and do less of the quote unquote traditional service. And it's more meeting with different nonprofits, different folks in the local community that are working to address those issues. And so that evolution started to happen probably about 11, 12 years ago when Carlos, who's with me and will be able to talk soon too, first started going on immersions like this. And I think what we also saw was a change in who goes on these trips. And just like Dr. Cook spoke about, how are you having opportunities where a student might have a chance to return to a place of heritage? So we've got trips that are preparing to go right now. One of them's to El Salvador, and we've got a couple Salvadoran students on that trip that are processing as they get closer what it's going to mean to go back to this country that their parents came from, that they've heard so much about, that's such a part of their identity, obviously. And we have to figure out, how are we supporting those students in a great way? Because I think that's sometimes what's missing in these things is you try and diversify it, but are you creating the support services to do that? Are you creating the services so every student is going to thrive? So to wrap it up, our program now is really kind of focused on how do we get the greatest diversity of students to go out on these experiences? How are we working in culturally sensitive and culturally relevant ways? And we focus on kind of intersecting values of simplicity, social justice, solidarity, and restorative justice throughout our immersions. So we'll dive in a bit more, but that gives you the baseline for AB. So I will kick it over, I believe, to Jorge next to talk a little bit about his program.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Dr. Cook, and thank you, Vice Provost Roberta Espinoza, for the introduction. My name is Jorge Cortez. I'm a research coordinator at the Center for the Study of Los Angeles, which is an undergraduate social research center. And under Study LA, our director, Fernando Guerra, who is faculty as well, is the person who actually runs this program. I'm the facilitator coordinator for the Mexico City trip, which is associated with a class. It's a CLST class, Chicana, Chicano, Latina, Latino Studies course called Mexico City, Los Angeles Comparison. And it's a course and trip that has existed for about 8 years now, since 2014. Professor Guerra had been doing other programs a while back in Cuernavaca, but it's evolved into this newer iteration of the trip that he designed in a way where it was only a week-long trip for students, and was doing it in a way where he was fundraising a lot of it so that it was economical and accessible to a lot of students, especially CLST majors and minors, but not exclusively. So this trip, I've been involved in it for about 5 years now. I love the trip. I think about it as a real global immersion trip, in the sense that, well, I think of study abroad as the biggest opportunity for self-analysis for any student who's trying to do anything. And in that situation, you learn about your heritage experience. And I say that because it so turns out that this trip, a lot of the students are Latinos, and it's not exclusive to them, but it turns out that way, and they get something very, very fulfilling out of this trip. For those that are there, they're understanding their own culture, they're fomenting a greater appreciation for it. And those that aren't getting a heritage experience out of this, it's an opportunity to challenge or embrace cultural perceptions, depending on, those things that they thought that they didn't know about. It's getting rid of some of the ignorance or not knowing of how people live in another place. So Mexico City, this trip is also, we make it a very serious trip, in that the people who have to go on this trip go through an interview process. And the reason for it is we want to make sure that they're there to really learn about what they're going to see there. What do I mean by that? That some people might have a perception, well, it's a 1-unit course, right? This is tied into a 1-unit course. And some people are taking it because they want the 1 unit, perhaps. Or other ones think that, oh, it's a party. We're going to go to Mexico City. We're going to go to Mexico and we're going to have a big party. We want to make sure those are not the reasons why they're going. They're going there to really engage and to understand the city and try to get something out of it. And the course is called Mexico City, Los Angeles Comparison. So in and of itself, what it's doing is that you're already getting something from Los Angeles, a mega city, and comparing it to Mexico City, another mega city that is obviously global, it's international. And by extension, you're comparing the United States and Mexico in that sense. So the week-long trip is chock full of things to do that have to do with everything from, scholarly panels to just learning, being immersed in the language, which can be very different for many people. The way people speak in Spanish in Los Angeles is very different than they do in Mexico City, for example. So there's all these surprises that students come across, and that's one of the things that we really enjoy about it, because it delves into identity for a lot of these students, and it becomes a very important factor for them. We delve into other issues that have to do with social justice, visiting the Tlatelolco massacre site with Plaza de las Tres Culturas. We talk about immigration, gentrification, which is a big issue right now in Mexico City. So you're thinking about historical things that we do and very current issues that are coming up. The issue with investigative journalism in Mexico City. So all these aspects we begin with them in the course, in the class itself. So the first few classes is a preparation for the trip. In many ways, but there's also projects associated with it where they're learning about cultural sites, but also exploring all of these factors and thinking about Mexico City and Los Angeles in the way that being mega cities, they have so many things that they have in common with traffic and pollution and earthquakes and media and how it's dealt with. So it's an exciting trip, and I know Isaac Cardenas is going to tell you a lot about his great experiences while being on that trip. I'll kick it back to you, Deanna.
Okay, thank you so much. So you see, we have a lot of exciting ways in which we do this work. I will talk about Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, global immersions broadly, and then specifically about my courses. And so one of the ways that we do this work is that we have a opportunity for faculty to apply who are teaching BCLA courses to apply to do an immersion experience, and their immersion experience is meant to more deeply help students understand the work within their classes. It is supposed to expand their concepts that students are learning about, and give them an opportunity to really apply the work that they're doing in the context in which it matters. And so our courses really cut across different kinds of topics. We have history courses that go to England. We have courses that go to Northern Ireland. We have courses that look at museums, some that have looked at sort of history, sort of natural history. And so, but the idea is that faculty will apply for specific courses, turn it into a global immersion, develop their course around, or develop the immersion as it relates to their course specifically. We do this annually. Obviously, during COVID, it shut down for a couple of years as we weren't studying abroad, but we started this because we wanted to give some students or all students the opportunity to get their feet wet in a short-term experience, and one where they were going with a known faculty member. It is a curated experience. That faculty member is designing it. Unlike study abroad, where you often go independently for a week, I think all of our experiences, frankly, are ones where they're much more curated, and we're going and engaging in these experiences as a group, and participating in, so in our own personal development as part of a group process. Specifically, my courses, for me, I work on issues of race and identity. And so I've taken a couple of courses and made them global immersions. And so one was racial socialization and identity in the African diaspora. So I tend to hit identity real close, real hard on my experiences. And that trip, the trip that I affiliated with that was going to Cuba and talking about race and racism and culture in Cuba, and Megan went on that one. I also did a course on that at that point was called Ghana Study Abroad, but it's based in African and Black psychology. And that happened to be a 3 weeks experience at that time, which is now turned into a global immersion. So we'll be gone for 10 days on the experiences coming up this May, but we're going and looking at African philosophy and spirituality, engaging in transatlantic trade conversations and returnings, and really focusing in on sort of how those things relate to identities today, and how we learn about that history. Megan went on that. Pretty much Megan has been on anything that I've done, which I call her my travel buddy, because we've gone to Ghana twice together, and Cuba. But so those focuses really are intentionally designed to attract and reframe how we think about things in terms of race and culture and identity as it relates to people of African descent. So that's kind of the introduction to mine. So now I actually want to turn it over to our esteemed alums and ask them to talk about their experiences. And so maybe I can start, I'll just kind of go around my screen and maybe start with Carlos. If you could talk about the trips you've been on, and how do they relate to your identities?
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook, and it's so great. This feels like a coming home, like a virtual coming home to LMU, which is so near and dear to my heart, and I really carry around with me. To briefly introduce myself, Carlos Rodriguez. I am an alum from LMU, graduated in 2011. And I'm now, my sort of job is Associate Director of Community Organizing with an organization that works alongside working class communities in LA to bring about policy change in public education. When I think about my experiences globally and how they impacted my identity, and how I now approach communities, diverse communities here in LA, and how I train others, new organizers and others in how to approach those communities. Really, like my worldview, my ethos stems in some of the trips at LMU that I had the opportunity to go to, especially because I was going on those trips as the first in my family to go to college, and child of immigrants myself. So I went to just sort of list them out first and foremost. And I think I'm the oldest of the alums, so I probably have the worst memory of specifics, but I was remembering this morning and a lot of stuff was coming back actually. So I went my freshman year to an AB trip in East LA that had to do with immigration. And that was while I had an uncle that was in the process of deportation. So talk about some heaviness, right? Like being sort of hit with like my own privilege of like being able to study the issue, right, on a trip, but also like having this family connection and crisis happening at the same time, simultaneous to that trip. So that was the first one. And then I went, I think my sophomore year, an AB trip to Guatemala, and to San Lucas, Toliman. So I don't know if that one's still a trip that's around, but that was a pretty popular trip back then. And just side note, but I went with my now wife. We weren't dating at the time, but one of those LMU stories, but we can save that for another webinar. And then I actually led an Ignacio Companions trip. I think it was the first one to Vietnam, in my junior year. And so that was very different, right? Because there was no sort of explicit identity connection there, like in Mexico, in East LA, and then in Guatemala, there was more of that Latin American connection, just from my background. And then I actually, in the middle of all of that, was just doing a lot of Decaloris trips as well, which is, another experience that I was having the opportunity to participate in. And then that all sort of led also to doing postgraduate service. And so I ended up, and I met Patrick at the time, like in college. He was in a different role as a resident minister and whatnot, and was inspired by him and others to do actually 2 years of postgraduate service in Chile. So I lived down there for 2 years, and that really, I mean, when I think of, and I'll never forget this, and I think it started sort of the seeds were planted a long time ago, in East LA, Guatemala, but then in Chile, they were really like, just like I was able to confront a lot more. And I'll never forget a Jesuit. A student had just passed away in one of the high schools where I was teaching some English, and his classmates, we were and they were like, they kind of created their own ritual to like commemorate their friend who had just passed, Jairo. And this Jesuit like turned to me and said, "This is what you came to Chile to see." And I'll never forget like how much he emphasized like the seeing. Like I think there's as much power in the seeing as there is in anything that I happen to do down there, any way that I happen to help. And really, I carry that moment still. And so to answer your question, I went on a whole biography of the trips I did, but they really, when it comes to my identity, well, what I'll say is that I think the trips plus the experience in Chile, I think I had always sort of limited myself, not in a bad way, but I had sort of my reference point around like my own dignity was very much connected to like just being the child of immigrants. But I think something that Guatemala and Vietnam and Chile like gifted me with is to like understand that the US has as much to learn from justice movements abroad as we have to teach, right? And there was something incredibly powerful about that lesson that I like carry with me to this day. And it's sort of like, just because there might be more, it's all about values, right? So that just because there might be more material wealth here doesn't necessarily mean that there's more progress. And so I really deeply learned, even recently, right, with friends in Chile, during the pandemic, like they were sending folks that got COVID a box full of basic supply, right? Like those were like policy choices rooted in values. And so yeah, I think I carry that with me as I enter spaces and as I continue to learn how my identity can interact and challenge in sort of our public discourse here in the US. So yeah.
That's a powerful first opening statement. So thank you for that. And I'm going to go now to Megan and see if you want to answer this question, which is about what trips have you gone on and how do they relate to your identity?
Yes, yes. First, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Cook, for inviting me. It's always a yes. And anytime you all need me to share my experience, I'm happy to do so. My name is Megan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a current policy and advocacy manager at La Defensa. And a few of the trips that I've gone on, some of which Dr. Cook has already laid out, I've been on 3 global immersion trips. One to Cuba, one to Ghana, and one to Senegal. And then I've also had the privilege of going on an alternative break trip to return to Ghana, all of which, of course, have had a profound impact on my identity. And of course, you'll see some themes that they are the spaces that I have chosen to kind of travel to center Blackness, right? And so as a Black woman, cis Black woman here in Los Angeles, it is incredibly important for me to just kind of get a better understanding of what Blackness means globally, and how that has an impact on what's happening here in the US, and in particular, how that's impacting my life as a working class person in Los Angeles, and then how I can use that, or at the time, how I could use that to inform my experience on the bluff. And thankfully, those experiences have really contributed to the way that I approach my work as an organizer, as a policymaker, and as just, someone who moves through the world. And I'm always texting Dr. Cook, like, how can I get back to traveling? And so I strongly encourage those who are tapping in, listening to this webinar, and those who will watch it well after, to seek every opportunity to really be, a student of life and go beyond what LA can provide to you, go beyond what the US has to offer, and really see what life looks like in other countries and other places, because it really helps to expand your understanding of self and others.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and thank you for opening that up. And I have lots of things to go back. Megan and I do talk a lot, and I'm always looking for ways to help folks continue to do this journey. All right, Isak.
Thank you,
Would you like
Dr.
to
Cook.
jump in? Yes.
Yes, and thanks everyone else for making space to be here in your agendas and your schedules. My name is Isak. I am an alumnus of the class of 2020. I studied theology, so most of my intention when I did these trips was to seek that spiritual connection with other people. I was able to go on 6 trips during my undergrad experience, and that was um, through the IC Companions trips to Cambodia. I also did an AB trip to California prisons. I studied abroad in Cordoba, Argentina through the Casa de la Mateada program. I also did Study LA's trip to Mexico City and Mexico. And also a supplemental trip through my Jainism course to India. And lastly, I led Decolotes trips in Tijuana. All of these trips really helped me understand how deeply privileged I was to be able to be a part of the world in that way, because my parents immigrated to the US from Mexico in their 20s. So they never had the opportunity to travel internationally for formal educational purposes. So, what does it mean for me to do that well, to not perpetuate these ideas that only certain people are able to move about the world freely, and to instead do that in a way that really honors that connection that we have to the land and to people. So with that, I'll pass it back to Dr. Cook.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll pause right now to say if anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll add them to the queue. So my question for you all, and anybody can answer, that first one was kind of a round of introductions, but people can answer if they like. What is it like to do trips where your identity is at the forefront versus the trips where the identity is not at the forefront? What did you get out of one versus the other? And I say that clearly, that you get at something out of all. But how was it different for you? Or was it different for you? And what did you get out of each kind of experience? Does anybody want to take that one?
I mean, I have a simple and maybe I guess a hard answer to that is it was on one level, and then this goes to Patrick's point at the beginning around support, and I think I know actually that there's more support now for first generation and folks that come from working class backgrounds, and as they do these trips. But on one level, it was more and it was more traumatic, right? And I don't think I was able to name that for a very long time. My wife works in like secondary trauma and stuff like that now, so I have a lot more language around that. But it doesn't mean that I wouldn't. I would still do them again, like if I could go back. Like it was still like incredible, but definitely on one level. And I think there just wasn't, at least in 2011, so this was 12 years ago, there wasn't an awareness or a playbook for staff even around how to differentiate, right? Like in education, we talk about differentiation or individualization, and there wasn't a playbook for how to support students from lower economic backgrounds, or Black students, or Latinx students, or other sorts of identities as they encountered sort of hardship that was closer to sort of more raw, right? Because it connected to their like daily struggles.
I'm happy to jump in on this question as well, and also chime into the question that's in the chat, which is, what would you say to those students who may not have had parents who have traveled abroad to some degree? And I was privileged enough. My first trip abroad with LMU actually was a first to go trip to the Dominican Republic. And so that kind of helped set the tone for me as to how I can travel abroad and what it means to do that intentionally by centering my identity as a first generation college student. And so I remember at the time, Dr. Latanya Reese Miles, or Dr. LT as we affectionately call her, I went into her office and I said, I'm not going on this trip anymore. And she looked at me and she was like, why? What's going on? I said, my mom had a fit yesterday. She didn't understand why I needed to get shots. She doesn't understand why I want to go to the Dominican Republic. She's a little bit fearful. She doesn't think it's safe. And I don't know what to do, so I'm not going anymore. I just back out. She said, That's okay. It's your experience as a first generation college student. What I want you to do is sit down, talk to your mom, explain X, Y, and Z, let her know the intention behind it. She can call me if she needs to, but she just kind of reaffirmed my experience. As one, I was scared too, right? But also, reaffirm my experience as having been the first in my family to do this, right? And so it really set the tone for me of how I can approach travel and how I can do that intentionally. And so ever since then, I've been very, very intentional about centering my identity and those who are like me in my experiences abroad, right? So that I can begin to find those commonalities and also be very clear about those differences so that I can continue to elevate that. I can continue to expand my understanding of it. But yeah, I've taken that with me from the beginning, right? That there is a way to travel with integrity and humility and to be aware of how that impacts you and others around you.
I absolutely agree with that point. And to that end of traveling in my own heritage, when I went to Mexico City, it was affirming, but also made me aware of how complicated the estrangement was from my own roots. There's an expression that is ni de aquí ni de allá, which roughly translates to neither from here nor there. And that was sort of my experience, as well as some of my other peers of Latina background, where, we are learning about our people's history, but we're also really removed from it. And so what does it mean to actually be there in that place and learn more through connection with community, through stepping through the land? And I would say that that is what makes it worth it, right? That is what made it worthwhile for me to take the leap out of the comfort zone of just living in Los Angeles and instead try to see what it might feel like in my body to be in other spaces where sometimes I do look like other people, where other times I don't look like other people. And how do I see my peers get treated based on that as well? That is something that also will come up later in our dialogue, but I wanted to share that as well as something important that I realized while traveling with other people in my cohorts.
I'm just going to follow up on a question, similar question, which is, so you all both very articulately talked about sort of, what this challenge is of engaging in these trips that are focused on heritage and sort of in first generation and being with folks who haven't done this before. Are there ideas around the support that LMU can provide to make the decisions easier, to support students in trying to get through those decisions? I heard what you said about LT telling you to sit down and talk these out, because we're still doing them and students are still having the same kinds of questions. So are there ideas that you all have that could help prepare students and help make this an easier transition? I'm not sure what we can do. How do we manage the trauma, right? So I know Carlos said that in some ways it could be more traumatic. Are there ideas that you all have or thoughts that you have about that?
I have a thought, and this, I'm not going to name which experience, but I'll, because it wasn't, but I think just being really intentional about when creating a trip and hosting the first information meeting, not sort of not assuming what the average student's family background or identity experience is. So, in one of these global experiences, I'll never forget it. People were talking, right? And my mom is a nanny still to this day. My dad works at a Mexican supermarket. I'm very proud of what they do, but it's working class jobs. And I'll never forget it, that the person that was facilitating sort of the introduction was like,
Uh-oh, you froze for a second.
Oh.
Oh, there you go. You're back.
anyway, one of the staff facilitating the introduction was sort of like, your parents, their lawyer friends must be like very, you know, like must think this is so like amazing that like their kids are going on X thing, right? Like, so even assuming like who is in the community and in the social like environment of like the parents of the students, like little things like that. I mean, you know, to me that now looking back feels like a microaggression, right? Because it sort of made me feel very unseen. And so not sort of, it made me feel unseen. So I would just like make sure to be very intentional about assumptions when talking to students that have signed up for trips.
Okay, I'm gonna ask, what surprised you during your experiences? Either while you were abroad or once you came back home?
I will jump in on this one. I remember very vividly when I came back home from my first experience traveling to Ghana. I was very sad, to be completely honest, and I was caught off guard. I think it was over spring break, so I think we had a couple of days, or maybe it was the summer, but we had some time to come back home. And I was sad. I missed Ghana. I missed being free. I missed learning in that environment. I missed the friends and the relationships that I made there. And I was heavy with the reality that the US is not this American dream, right? Like there are places and other environments that have been severely impacted by the way that the US has moved throughout the world, right? And so that is something that I was like faced to write down and to journal and to sit with. And with that recognition, you know, how am I going to address that in the spaces that I occupy so that I don't perpetuate the same harms and, you know, that I'm just kind of beginning to unlearn, you know, some of the things that I have been force fed. And thankfully, I had the experiences with some very brilliant professors, Dr. Cook and Dr. Grills, and we were able to debrief and demystify and really talk about, you know, some of those experiences. But coming back and just having to sit with that was pretty shocking. And so I would say it was surprising, and I was grateful to be able to have the tools to move through that. That's not to say don't travel abroad. I am a core component of traveling abroad, but yes.
Emotions are real and good. You get to learn from those. Anybody else want to talk about what surprised them?
I would like to add that I was surprised at how long some of the connections lasted afterward. Specifically in the context of the Study LA program, it is a summer course, and we have seniors on that trip who, you know, at that time, like after the trip, they've graduated. There's no other class I'll share with them, but I was still able to keep in contact with many of them, and we always reminisce on the experiences we shared in Mexico City. I would say that that is also one of the ways that we can improve on the immersions that we have for students, because oftentimes for me it felt like I built this wonderful community while experiencing all these different emotions together, and then suddenly we all are busy again. Suddenly we have class and it's a different schedule this semester, and for me it was almost like there were empty promises of wanting to, you know, have a reunion next year, but because life happens, you know, it just never quite happened. And I believe that if we were more prepared to host those reunions, we would also have more space to have that debrief 1 year later too, because it doesn't just happen immediately. For me, some of the realizations I had after had to settle in, and I had to really unwind that yarn together. But oftentimes I didn't have everyone from my groups to unwind that wheel together. So that would be one little adjustment that I think would be great.
I'm weaving in a couple of the questions. But I'm gonna kind of jump off maybe with what Isak said. So your challenge was not being able to stay connected with the folks with whom you had built really strong relationships with. What was it like to travel in these groups as LMU students with people who may have shared your heritage or not shared your heritage? Were those relationships similar? Were they different? Did that group dynamic, was it different for different folks with whom you were on the trip with? Or was it more of a large group experience and sort of lots of folks kind of stay connected?
I would say for me, it depended on the size of the trips. So, for example, with Decolores, some of our groups were only 10. So we had the ability to still do our reunion at the end of the year somehow. And that was really helpful in that processing experience, as well as, having the faculty who join our trips also see them around campus, also maybe have them as a professor later on, or have had them in the past. It's interesting to note how the connections that these programs engender, they are usually cross campus, right? Most of the time I wasn't with peers who shared the same college as mine. Sometimes they had different extracurriculars as mine. And yet I think that's what made them more important, because it didn't perpetuate this idea that you stay in your bubble at LMU. You're in athletes, or you're in Greek life, and that's all that you should do. Instead, it really helps to progress community. And I would say that there is, or there was for me as an undergrad, a big desire to continue growing those connections across spaces that I wouldn't normally be in.
I really like this question. I began thinking about the difference between my experiences traveling through global immersion or first to go or alternative breaks with my experience studying abroad for a semester. So that was different. Of course, I studied abroad with a cohort of students from LMU, but I could tell that our intentions for studying abroad were all very different. And we all came from very different backgrounds. And so there wasn't this shared understanding of, what we're here to do and what we have set out to accomplish while studying abroad. Of course, that's for a semester. And I had the privilege of, living in the same flat with all of them and all of those things, but just kind of thinking about how those few experiences are different. One, studying abroad for a semester in London, and then the group experiences that we had, with the class. I can definitely glean that if you're studying abroad through global immersion or alternative breaks, there is this shared understanding, right? That here's what we came to do, and here's how we'll approach it, and here's how we'll, dissect it and understand it, and kind of build upon this together. And so you have that very clear support system to kind of undergird your learnings at the same time. Whereas when you're studying abroad, you're on your own. Of course, there is typically a professor who goes with you, but it's definitely different. And so I can see the benefits from doing both and the differences from doing both.
So there's a question in the chat that's about whether these experiences are more about personal growth than academics for you all. And I'm wondering if, I don't know, maybe I'm going to call on Jorge in terms of the intentionality of the trip, and then among our alums, Patrick as well. I'm going to Jorge because I know it's connected to a class, and the other ones are co-curricular, but is it more academic or more social development? So I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to ask the panel that as well.
I'm going to say both. So there's definitely a personal growth element to it, as Isaac alluded to from it. But we do, it's a solid week there, first of all. It's a smaller trip. Some of the comments Megan made, I think a 3-6 month trip, a semester trip, it's a very different type of trip, you know, in that sense. So it's a group that sticks together for the most part and partakes in scholarly panel discussions in UNAM, Iberoamericana, the Jesuit University in Mexico City. We do tend to do a lot of, there's a projects involved within the course. So all those things are there. That's not to say that personal growth doesn't happen. It absolutely does happen. So I would say it's a perfect mixture of both.
Okay, anybody else want to jump into that?
Yeah, I can speak to the impact for me, and the impact has been both and, yeah, like Jorge said. I mean, I you know, all these, the trips, you know, after LMU, I got a master's of public administration at NYU and really focused on civic engagement and different models of civic engagement. And the whole reason I did that was because of the formation I got at LMU, in large part because of these trips. And so for me, there's been as much personal growth and like Megan so well said, like there's been as much sort of consciousness developed around like how to approach other communities, and like international travel in general. Even like when my wife and I went on our honeymoon, like how we leaned into that, right? Like was different, I think, than if we wouldn't have been participants in AB trips. And so there's definitely been that impact in terms of personal values and approach to the world, but also on the academic side for sure, and the career side.
Yeah, I think I'll go for it, Isaac.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So one of the things that attracted me immediately about LMU was the value for the educational of the whole person. And I definitely think that without having had all those immersive experiences, my education wouldn't have been holistic. I needed those opportunities to practice what I was learning in my classes to really understand what it meant to have higher education in a world where, even though everyone does have the right to have movement, that isn't practiced, right? Travel is a privilege. And so to understand that my educational growth was developed because of the institutions I was able to also interact with abroad and domestically helped me to further understand who I wanted to be as I was growing up, right? I wanted to be someone that wasn't just using my privilege to flaunt it and post incredible Instagram stories, right? It was more so about wanting to deepen my awareness of the world I live in and why it is that I'm the one that's getting all this opportunity as opposed to other people, and how I could try to address that. I'll pass it back to you, Patrick.
Thank you. I was thinking about a group I led once when I led the De Colores program, and I took a group down there, and I think everyone on this Zoom right here can relate to this, of like, when you go on an immersion with a group of students, there's a group who just gets it and they're great. They're going to compliment everything you're going with. They understand. There's another group where, like, if you do your job right, they're going to come along in a really incredible way. And then I would say, like, there's 1 or 2 students where sometimes you're like, and my job right now is just to keep you safe and get you back, because they're not quite open to the experience yet. And I had a student that was like that. He was cussing up a storm on the trips. And, if you've been abroad, everyone knows the F word, whether you speak English or not. And he was saying it so much, it was like, man, I just need you to tone it down. And so we had this kind of really rough trip. And months later, he reached out to me during finals week and he's like, hey, can we meet? And he was graduating. And, I'm like, there's no one else I'd rather not meet with right now than you right now in a stressful week. But we found some time. So we got together and he's kind of stumbling through. And I'm like, I don't mean to be rude, but it's like a stressful week for everyone, man. Like, what do you need? And he was like, I must have been so difficult to deal with on that trip. And I was going through a lot and I had never seen A, poverty in that way, B, it related to an aspect of my own upbringing and my own identity. And so I was struggling in real time to process it. And the way I handled that was to act in the way I did. And he said, and I guess all these months later, I didn't want to graduate without you knowing, like, that trip had a really transformative experience on how I think, on how I look at the world. And he was like, you mentioned there were a couple students that couldn't afford this. I was like, yeah. And he had to brought envelopes with the amount of money it cost to go on that experience and said, I just don't think any student should never be able to participate in this because of finances. And so I think, like, it's personal and it's academic, but it's something Isak said earlier that made me think of that, of like, sometimes the impact comes much later, right? Like Megan might be having an incredible time in Ghana and that flight home and those first few days back in the United States, that impact is still happening then, and it's happening in 6 months, and it's happening in a year. And so I think it speaks to what I would also say is kind of an urgency for us to get like first year and second year students on these immersions, because you get students on these immersions and I think it actually can impact their academic career. It can get them to a space where they say, I didn't know I wanted to study that until I came here. And now this makes sense. And I feel an excitement about my academics that I didn't feel prior. And so I think that also speaks to that first question of like, how do you get folks to go? It's like these immersions, if you have not experienced travel abroad, if you've not traveled much as a family, they're a chance to kind of do it in a safe and secure way. You got Dr. Cook, you got Jorge, you got myself accompanying you through the journey and hopefully giving you courage to go study abroad and live in that flat, to go live abroad in Chile. So I think that's a really important thing about it too. And to that second question of like, should these be required experiences? Yes and no, like, yeah, absolutely. But we do this thing in higher ed where we say, oh, let's require that, but we don't put any funding behind it. We don't put any support behind making that possible. So we've got a number of students who through documentation or whatever else might not be able to go abroad, but we live in a global city. And so how are we finding ways to make sure that barriers are removed for participation in every way possible in global experiences, so the personal can be affected, so the academic can be affected, and we'll have alums like these three all these years later because of those experiences.
Yep, I love that. I had been holding that question too about whether it should be required. And I was thinking about the question because I think my first reaction is no, because there's so many different experiences that people have. But I really like what you just said is that, particularly as director of engaged learning, there are lots of opportunities to engage globally, locally. Right, there's lots of places to be to get to understand some of the social experiences, the context, the world views of folks, and not actually have to leave the country or leave the space for whatever number of reasons, including mental wellness and can I travel and very technical issues around travel and that sort of thing. But we've got lots of opportunities, and that's an interesting question for the university. We do have an engaged learning requirement, so to that extent it's there, and then how we implement that might be different, but that is a way to try to continue to make sure that we are connecting more broadly. I also wanted to just throw in response to that question, the experience that I had in 2020, because the last time we had done a global immersion in the African and Black psychology course was spring of 2020, at which point everyone will know that we did not go to Ghana because it was the beginning of the COVID lockdown. And last year we had a student, and let me be clear, we learned about it during spring break. We were going at the end of the thing. We came back from spring break and there was all sorts of fluctuations, and students were depressed, and can we just go on our own, and can we do this? And we were like, no, there's a global pandemic, because we really want to go. A year and a half, 2 years later, we had students that came back and said, because what we're trying to teach, which the global immersion component is part of, we're reframing how people think about psychology and what it means, what this discipline means. And so they're like, it's still one of the most impactful classes that we've had, despite the fact that we actually didn't travel. And so I think you're doing a both and in these situations. You are trying to encourage this self-development, professional development, social development in the midst of an academic, in the midst of an academic space. So we can do both of those. Did anybody want to jump in on this question? Any of those couple questions I think we were answering? And if not, I'll go on to another one. And we've begun to answer some of these questions already. So I'm going to ask this one because I don't think it got addressed explicitly, so I'll ask it, which is, how was race portrayed or discussed or not discussed in the places that you visited?
I can speak to this one a little bit from Vietnam, actually, and I'll also never forget. Well, first of all, I'm still processing Patrick's story about the Decalores trip and the student later on give, the seeds sort of that were planted. And anyway, just to name that story really struck me. And I was also processing what Megan was talking about with like the coming back. I remember like, I think we called it like the Decalores pit in your stomach. Like as soon as the van was like coming into like Westchester, like I just felt like this dread of like going back to like normal life. And like just not feeling as loved for whatever reason. Anyway, that's a different thing. But in terms of race, I'll never forget. And I don't think there was, I mean, we reflected on it very generically this moment, but I'll never forget, and because I had no idea that this was a reality in Vietnam. We were in Pleiku, which is in the central part of Vietnam, and there's a big native Vietnamese population, which actually, yeah, they like were like forced to take sides during the Vietnam War, and then really like got sort of because of I think they were taking the North Vietnamese side, and they ended up being really impacted, and a lot of times like killed by in part the US military. And so anyway, we were in this little town, and there was these kids that we were like teaching English to. And I'll never forget. So typically they're just sort of like seeing colorism so intensely in 2010. So there was a computer lab that these kids that we were teaching English to that would come during the week and stay with some nuns. And we were using a computer lab to teach English. And like it was like the town's computer lab, and it was like probably 6 or 7 computers. And I was in there with a few of my LMU peers. And so they're darker skinned native Vietnamese, the Jai Rai, I think is what they're and these like lighter skinned Vietnamese kids come in, and I don't know how the kids that they just know, they like all have to stand up and leave, and these lighter skinned Vietnamese kids just take over them. Or take over the spots, and nobody like told us that was a reality in this town in 2010. And I just remember being like, it was so jarring because it was just to learn that like it was just jarring to learn, and it was heartbreaking. And I mean, we had built such incredible relationships with these kids, and so we reflected on it after that, but we weren't prepared for that moment. And yeah, just that story is still with me. And I think it deeply impacted, also going back to Megan's point, I think, I also helped, after I finished in Chile, my 2 years, I helped host Patrick and a bunch of students for an Ignacio Companions trip. And I think heartbreak, like it's a part of this like, it's just like heartbreak is a part of life, right? But it's definitely a part of this. And it's not just heartbreak about what you see about the world, it's about what you see about yourself, like back home. Like, and so I remember leaving Vietnam, saying goodbye to these same kids, and like there was so much weeping in the van. All the students were like crying, myself included. And so I think the heartbreak sort of, like Dr. Cook said, sort of lets you know that it was real. That doesn't mean that we can't be more intentional about the reflection aspect before and after. But I do think just being honest with students that there is going to be heartbreak. Like that is part of the process of encountering yourself and encountering the world. So yeah.
Anyone else want to jump into the question about, you know, how race was brought up explicitly or implicitly or not discussed at all? But thank you, Carlos, because that was, you know, being able to see sort of how the world sees itself and how the world operates in ways that we are not prepared to understand or don't believe operate outside the United States, or don't think that people have different kinds, you know, different ways to think about race, color, class, and whatever kind of divisions we have is definitely a jarring experience. And so having that kind of eye opener is definitely jarring. Go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, I'll chime in briefly on this piece. I know in my experience traveling to London, race was not explicitly discussed. And that was difficult for me as a Black woman in Britain, in the UK. Like, it was just kind of jarring. And so I remember having to center that in all of my classes, like literally every single class that I took while abroad, like, and this is how race is impacted, and I had to be that person, right? Because I can never sit idle when I know that something is, when I know what's up. So it was interesting to be in that situation while studying abroad. But for the most part in my other experiences, because I was very intentional about my global immersion trips or about, being a first generation college student and all of those things, it was absolutely centered. Now, what I didn't expect, and this is also surprising, because of some of the places that I traveled where people are just Black, like it's not like a thing, like literally everyone there is Black. So the way that folks talked about race was different. Like there was really no race in that way. And so it was interesting to have to analyze it, right? And to study it and to think about it and find new ways to understand it, because the way that we understand race and racism in the US is quite different than race and racism in Ghana or Senegal or Cuba even, right? But it still has pretty profound impacts. And so when I think about the question around how identity was very clearly spoken about in some spaces and in others, it just helped me to, again, refine my understanding of how this is constantly at work, and it's at work on a spectrum, right? Like it's not the same here and it's not going to be the same somewhere else. And then to just chime in on the question again around it, whether or not it's academic or personal, I too say it's a both and, because the knowledge that I'm gaining ultimately has really strong impact on and who I am as a person. And I can't really separate the two, right? Kind of once you understand and know more, you just do more, you are better for it. And so it's absolutely a both and.
You made me think about it. It's like you know your why of why you're studying something. As you know, I don't know, that was sort of just one of the things that came to mind for me. So I think we're going to ask about the fact that you all did a lot of traveling while at LMU. How did you all go about, and we've already heard that people had different experiences, whether it was first time or, hadn't been out the country. How did you all go about making sure this was financially feasible for you all to go? What were some of the mechanisms that LMU had or that you personally had to be able to make these experiences possible? And I think that also relates to that first question that was asked in the chat, which was, how do you get people to go? Because I know one of the big barriers a lot of times is the fear of the finances.
I'm happy to jump in here as well. So I don't come from a family of money. So my mom was not going to be the one to shell out any dollars for me to attend any of these trips, let alone she didn't want me to go. So I had to figure it out on my own. And thankfully, I made it very clear that I was interested in traveling abroad. I talked to all of my professors. I talked to the dean. I talked to staff. And I just made it very clear, like, this is something that I want to do. How can we make this possible? And I didn't give up. And of course, I put in a lot of labor on the back end as well. I will never forget the days when I developed a spreadsheet and I was looking online for scholarships. Like, okay, I'm applying for this one today and I'm applying for this one tomorrow. And this one is due on this day. Okay, we didn't get this one, but this one is $300. So we're getting that, right? And so I was very active or proactive about resourcing my education because I had to be, right? And thankfully, there is a wealth of resources. It breaks my heart, Patrick, to hear that, not all the time the university decides to resource some of these incredible experiences, but there is a wealth of resources within LMU. And so it really, for me, it was a matter of building authentic relationships enough so folks would be willing to pour into my education and support me and to just kind of want to help me get to where I wanted to be. And also recognizing that that's a mutual experience, right? Like, I can't go on these trips and mess it up if I know that there's a whole community that's counting on me to really bring back what I've learned. And so it's kind of it was a two-way street. It was a lot of labor of love, I would say. And I'm very grateful to have leaned on the LMU community and my community at home to make sure that this was able to happen.
I can quickly speak to this, very similar to Megan. I had a lot of support from the CSA office, Pam Rector at the time, really, and others, a lot of others, and the campus ministry office, just either through being a leader, having the cost subsidized that way. I think it's like cut in half if you're a leader for some of the trips. And then I think there was internally scholarships at CSA as well. So I would encourage the university, just last week I got a call from the development office. So it would be awesome to keep on investing in these experiences for students that don't necessarily have the financial backing at home, because I definitely did not as well. And then just quickly to the why I also went, but I was in Majas, so it was in the water. Like, it was like what everyone else was kind of doing, or a lot of other people were doing, like older peers that I was going out and doing service domestic, like in LA, going to homeless shelters or to Bourbon Day high school and doing mentoring. And so it was stuff that juniors and seniors that I got to know through that community and became mentors were sort of just making like the cool thing to do, right? So I think also just from fomenting those sort of communities at LMU could be another way to continue to encourage these sort of trips. And then also just lastly, because I definitely need to say this, I was going at one point on too many, like my grades actually took a dip because I was going on every single Decaloris trip. And I'll never forget him. He's still a close friend, Marty Roars, who worked in campus ministry, sitting me down and saying, like, you're going to flunk out because you're like going on too many of these trips. So I was almost like, I think it's like there is something around balance, and almost because I didn't want to, because I was the first one in college, etc. Like, it was it became like I almost felt more at home to some degree after going on like so many Decaloris trips. I felt like more seen there in some ways than like dealing with my own stuff on campus around academics. And so that was a tough lesson to learn, but I, thankfully, with some good critical conversations, I was able to get a healthier balance on that.
And I would like to add that what helped me the most was the transparency that all of these programs had with how much it was going to cost and what was available to aid us. Because when I did postgraduate service domestically after, there was more of a kind of yanking out of how much are we subsidized? What is the expenses that we're going to incur going to look like? So if we teach our students to budget, it's not just going to apply for these programs, but also lifelong. And I think that I was very fortunate in that regard because I had the ability to talk to my professors about how I can create a budget and looking up YouTube videos, understanding what it looks like. I think the study abroad office also had some kind of webinar or an event to discuss this or a worksheet as well. But definitely increasing that financial literacy so that we don't shock students by seeing numbers on a paper, but instead we really encourage the understanding of how to not just crowd what is it, crowdfund, or I forget the term, but not just relying on your network, to possibly help you with donations, but also to understand the impact of financial literacy for homes where usually, in my case, my parents never talked to me about money. So it was something that I didn't really have the knowledge of, yet I had this great desire to be a global citizen. And I was really lucky that LMU did have that kind of dialogue with me as a student where even in our classes as a discussion, we would talk about this instead of keeping it as a hush-hush, low-key thing that, you only talk about if you are in deep need, and that deep need should have a shame around it. Like, no, we need to destigmatize this so that we create more access, as Patrick was alluding to.
Awesome. So we are coming close to the end of our time here, and I wondered if we could do a lightning round. What is the one thing that you would want to say and make sure that people understand before they leave this webinar about going abroad in 20 seconds or less? Who'd like to have the first word? And who'd like to have the last word? And then we'll fill in between.
I'll go first.
Okay, all right.
So my, I guess, 3 words are cross-cultural dialogue. That is what I gained from all of this, that I have the skills in order to practice cross-cultural dialogue, not just in my workplace, but also as a student in one of the most diverse cities in the world. I'll pass.
I don't know if Jorge and I are in on this, but I'm going to cheat and get in on it. If you do not think you can go abroad, come and see me. I think there's a lot of students for any variety of reasons, whether finances or just a fear of travel or trouble navigating parental conversations, think they cannot. And we've been through so many of those conversations with students in years prior. And I think, probably speaking for Deanna, Jorge, and myself, there's nothing that feels better than feeling like you're being able to help someone get where they should be. So if we are able to support you, come and see us and we'll make it happen, whether our program or someone else's.
Jorge?
Yes, so to what Patrick said, of course, our door is always open. Dr. Guerra and I, this is his door over here. Always here. We talked about how we try to make it as economical as possible. There's always possibilities when it comes to that. I wanted to, because I work at a research center, I did want to say something about statistics, about how amazing study abroad is, to just encourage others to do so. The Institute for the International Education of Students did a 50-year-long analysis through 3,400 respondents and found that 97% of study abroad alumni felt that their trip increased their maturity, that it also increased their self-confidence by 96% felt that, and 89% felt that it facilitated a greater tolerance for ambiguity, which is the tolerance for ambiguity would be defined as a degree of which an individual is comfortable with uncertainty, unpredictability, conflicting directions, and multiple demands. Basically, it's saying that you know how to adapt because of this. You learned how to an element of adaptability. That's what I wanted to say. Anyhow, and that was 89% of them who said that. So there's such a positive outcome to study abroad. You're seeing it here, but I even with this, well, Patrick gave that example of the student who what seemed to be a very negative experience was actually a very positive one. And I feel like even in the experiences that I've had in the 3 or 4 years with students, that's the case with a lot of those that felt they really didn't. It does come up somewhere else, you know? So that's all I want to say.
I'll jump in and just say, just do it. I was scared a lot of the time, if not every single time I was getting ready to go on a trip. But just do it and have the faith that it'll really have a brilliant return on investment. If finances is a reason why you're hesitant, again, there are a lot of resources on LMU's campus in particular. I don't know of any other university that really enforces and encourages young people to travel as much as LMU. So you're in a unique environment in that regard. And if you're just scared because you're first gen, or you're just scared because you've never traveled or been away from your family, I just encourage you to have more conversations to really help yourself feel comfortable with getting off the bluff and doing something that you've never done before. As many times as I traveled, I had a lot of anxiety. And so I just encourage you again to have those conversations and to just do it, because you'll be a better person for it. And I'll pass it to the next person.
Just do it. I love it. I wrote it on a Post-it note. I wrote, it's gonna be, there's gonna be, just do it, and do it for yourself, but do it for LA. Like I really, if this last year, there's the news in LA, local news has shown anything, is that LA needs to confront white supremacy. There needs to be transformative organizing that happens. And as a proud LMU alum, I really believe that there's something special in the water at LMU. And we need more and more students like Megan, like Isaac, like Patrick, alums that go, that are transformed and have their hearts broken and their heart grows and their heart's on fire to like really transform this city and ask tough questions at City Hall, and at other places of power and privilege across the city. And so LA needs us all, no matter who you are, what your identity is. This city needs you. And part of that is going away to learn about yourself and ask yourself some tough questions and see some things that will help you embrace that inner fire. So yeah, we need you. LA needs you to do it.
I really want to say amen. So thank you all for joining us. My final word is really for the faculty and staff who are here. Know that you have support from us on campus to continue to do this work. We're not the only ones doing it, and we shouldn't be limiting the expansion of these kinds of opportunities for students on campus. But I want to thank Isaac and Carlos and Megan and Jorge and Patrick and Stephanie Mejia for starting, for helping us begin this, to Roberta Espinosa for starting out our panel today. I hope this has been as rich for you as it has been for me. It has been great to talk with you all and to hear from you all and to hear the perspectives that you provide. And my last word is, y'all are alums, so you can target your funding for global experiences if you give back to LMU. That's my last word. Have a great day, the rest of you all. Take care.